The door opened 3 minutes after I rang the bell. The man standing there had damp hair and bare feet. His skin was still flushed from the shower, and droplets of water clung to the ends of his pale blonde hair, catching the late afternoon light like spun gold. He was beautiful in the way that alphas often were. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, a body that moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to prove their worth. He was wearing an oversized crewneck sweater that hung past his hips, soft gray cashmere that had clearly once been expensive. I recognized it before I recognized him. The cuffs were slightly frayed from years of wear. The collar had that particular stretched looseness that came from being pulled over someone's head 1,000 times. I knew that sweater intimately. I had bought it for Julian on our first anniversary. Merino wool from a small mill in the Scottish Highlands. I had spent weeks researching it, reading reviews, checking fabric weights, even emailing the mill to confirm the exact shade of heather gray. When it arrived, Julian had opened the box with genuine delight and pulled it over his head immediately, right there in the kitchen, wearing it for the rest of the day, even though it was too warm for the season. He had worn it to bed that night, laughing, saying it felt like being held. He had worn it on rainy Sundays when we curled up on the couch together. He had worn it on mornings when he came downstairs and found me already at my desk, and he would come up behind me and wrap his arms around my shoulders, the soft wool brushing against my cheek as he kissed my hair. He had worn it so often over the next 3 years that I used to tease him about needing to buy a second one. "It's my favorite," he would say, pulling it on again on a chilly evening, wrapping his arms around himself like he was hugging something precious. "Everything else is just clothes. This is like being wrapped in you." He had said that once, early in our marriage, and I had never forgotten it. I had carried it with me through every argument, every late night at my desk, every moment of doubt. "He loves me." He said so. The sweater means something. 2 years into our marriage, I had once held it up while reorganizing his closet and asked if we could donate it. The shoulders were wearing thin. The elbows were starting to pill. Julian had looked at me like I'd suggested we get rid of his grandmother's engagement ring. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with something that looked almost like panic. "That stays," he'd said, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. "That stays forever." He had taken it out of my hands and folded it himself, pressing the creases with unnecessary care, smoothing the fabric with the flat of his palm, like he was smoothing something else entirely. Then his mother, Patricia, had eventually taken a box of his old things to store at her place. She had a large house with plenty of storage, she'd said. It would be easier. Julian was a beta, and betas didn't have the same attachment to physical objects that alphas and omegas did, or so she claimed. Apparently the sweater had made its way back to her. Just not to her son. Just not to my husband. The man at the door blinked when he saw me. For half a second, surprise flickered across his handsome face. His alpha scent, something warm and rich, like sandalwood and sea salt, with an undertone of something sweet and floral that I couldn't quite identify, spiked for just a moment before he controlled it. His eyes widened, then narrowed, assessing me. I could practically see him calculating, trying to figure out who I was and why I was standing on the doorstep of the beach house he had clearly come to think of as his. Then he recovered and gave me a polite, practiced smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The kind of smile that said, "I'm in control here, and I'll figure out how to handle you. Hi, can I help you?" I didn't answer right away. I looked past his shoulder, letting my eyes adjust to the dimmer light inside the house I had bought with my own money, for a family I had believed was mine. The beach house didn't look the way it had 8 months earlier when I handed Patricia and Gerald the keys. I remembered that day so clearly it hurt. Patricia had hugged me, her thin arms surprisingly tight around my shoulders, her scent warm with something that might have been genuine affection. Gerald had shaken my hand with real emotion, his eyes wet, his voice thick with gratitude. "This is more than we ever dreamed," he had said. "Marcus, you've given us a gift. You've given us peace." I had felt proud that day. Useful. Like I was finally building something that mattered. Growing up as an omega in a world that told you your value was limited, that told you your biology was a weakness, that told you the best you could hope for was to find a good alpha and let them take care of you. I had fought so hard against all of that. I had built a career. I had earned my own money. I had proven, over and over, that I was more than my designation. Standing in that beach house, watching Gerald cry, I had thought, I did it. I made a family. I belong. Now, a pale silk scarf was draped over the back of the sofa, the fabric whispering in the breeze from an open window. 2 half-finished glasses of red wine sat on the coffee table next to take-out containers from a local seafood place. The condensation rings leaving damp circles on the wood. A pair of designer sneakers rested beside a pair of Oxfords I knew very well. Julian's Oxfords. Dark brown leather, hand-stitched, with a slight wear pattern on the left heel from the way he dragged his foot slightly when he walked. I had bought those Oxfords for him last Christmas. He had said they were the nicest shoes he'd ever owned. He had worn them to every important meeting since. He had worn them the day he told me he loved me for the first time. Next to them was something smaller that bothered me even more. Julian's travel charger. The one with a strip of red tape wrapped around the cord because he was always misplacing hotel chargers and wanted to distinguish his. He carried it on every overnight trip. I had packed it for him myself before the supposed Boston conference, tucking it into the side pocket of his carry-on along with his noise-canceling headphones and a small bag of almonds, because he always got hungry on planes. I had kissed him goodbye at the door, watched him drive away, and gone back to my office to work. I had told myself I was being a good husband. I had told myself that trust meant not questioning. That charger meant he had not simply stopped by his parents' house on the way home. He had brought overnight things. He had expected to sleep there. He had planned to be here, in this house, with this beautiful pale-haired alpha. On the console by the stairs sat his leather toiletries bag, half unzipped. I could see the silver cap of his cologne inside, the same cologne I had bought for him 2 Christmases ago. The saleswoman had described it as woodsy with notes of bergamot and cedar. Julian had worn it every day since. The bottle was nearly empty now, and I had been planning to replace it for his birthday next month. I had been planning a party. I had been planning a weekend away. I had been planning a future. The details were so ordinary that they were worse than anything dramatic. Nothing in that room looked rushed. No one had been caught in the middle of a one-time mistake. The house looked lived in. The wine glasses had been used, then set down, then picked up again. The takeout containers were from 2 different nights, judging by the faded labels and different restaurant logos. There was a half-read paperback on the arm of the sofa, spine cracked, pages dog-eared. A bookmark from a local bookstore I had never visited. There was a pair of sunglasses on the windowsill. A phone charger plugged into the wall. A man's cardigan draped over the back of the armchair. There was evidence of a life being lived here. A life I knew nothing about. He had told me he was in Boston for a 3-day pharmaceutical conference. I had seen him off at the airport. He had kissed me goodbye, a quick press of lips, and promised to bring me back a souvenir from the gift shop. He always did that, bought me something small and ridiculous, a magnet or a keychain, and acted like it was the most thoughtful thing in the world. I had smiled and waved as he walked through security. I had gone home and worked on my manuscript, feeling proud of how supportive I was. I had texted him that night, asking how the hotel was, and he had replied, "Great. Room service is amazing. Wish you were here." I had bought the beach house 8 months earlier for Julian's parents to retire in. The deed was in my name. I had paid for it myself. $240,000 from an investment account I had opened when I was 22, years before I met Julian, years before I even knew what love was supposed to look like. Another $60,000 from foreign rights to my 3rd novel, the one that had sold in 14 countries and made me realize I could actually do this, that I could actually build a life for myself. I had sat at the closing table and signed my name a dozen times, each signature feeling like a gift I was giving to the family I had chosen. A gift that had been taken for granted, then stolen, then used to impress someone else. I had given Patricia and Gerald the largest bedroom because it had the best view of the Atlantic. You could watch the sunrise from that room. I had stood in it on the day of the final walkthrough, imagining them waking up to that light, drinking their coffee on the small balcony, finally at peace after years of worrying about money and health and the future. I had imagined Julian's face when I told him it was done. I had imagined his arms around me, his whispered gratitude, the way he would look at me like I was the most wonderful person in the world. Now a hairdryer was running somewhere down that hallway. The sound was intimate, domestic, the kind of sound you only heard in the morning of someone who felt completely at home. Someone who had been here long enough to settle in. Someone who had made this space their own. The man at the door shifted his weight. His bare feet made a soft sound against the hardwood floor. "Are you looking for someone?" he asked again, his voice carefully neutral. He was trying to figure me out. I could see it in the way his eyes traveled over me, assessing my clothing, my posture, my scent. He was an alpha, and alphas were trained from birth to read threats. I was an omega. I was supposed to be the threat. "Julian," I said. His smile paused. Something flickered in his eyes. "Oh." Julian went out to pick up seafood. Then he added too quickly, "I mean Mr. Covington." I looked down at the Oxfords. For some reason I felt very calm. Not peaceful. Not numb exactly. Just calm in the way you get when the final piece of a puzzle falls into place, and suddenly every strange little detail from the past 8 months has an explanation. The late nights at the office. The weekend trips that got canceled at the last minute. The way Julian had stopped looking at me during sex. His eyes sliding away to somewhere I couldn't follow. The new scent on his clothes, faint and floral, that he had claimed was a new cologne sample from a colleague. The way he had started pulling away when I reached for him. The way he had stopped saying "I love you" first. The way he had started talking about needing space and time to think. I understood now. I understood all of it. Julian hadn't been pulling away from me. He had been pulling towards someone else. Someone who smelled like sandalwood and sea salt. Someone with pale blonde hair and beautiful eyes and a body that moved like it had never known doubt. Someone who was standing in my house, wearing my husband's sweater. Before I could say anything, Patricia appeared in the hallway. She stopped when she saw me. Her first reaction wasn't happiness. It wasn't surprise or joy or even confusion. It was irritation. Her alpha scent, something earthy and sharp, like ginger root and dry autumn leaves, curled through the air with unmistakable displeasure. Her eyes narrowed. Her jaw tightened. She looked at me the way you look at a salesperson who has shown up at your door uninvited. "Marcus, what are you doing here? You should have called." I had been in Wilmington for a speaking engagement. A literary festival. My publisher had flown me down for a panel and a signing. I had been nervous about it for weeks, but the event had gone well. The audience had been warm. People had asked good questions. I had signed copies of my new novel for an hour, smiling, shaking hands, feeling like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The event had finished earlier than expected, and I had decided to surprise my in-laws with lunch. I had even stopped at a bakery on the way and bought a lemon cake, because Patricia had mentioned once that she loved lemon cake. I had felt generous and happy, full of the satisfaction of a job well done and a family to share it with. I had pictured Patricia's surprised smile, Gerald's warm handshake, the pleasure of arriving unannounced because you knew you were always welcome. That had been my mistake. Surprises only work when everyone has been telling the truth. I nodded toward the man. "Who is he?" Patricia moved faster than I would have expected. She stepped between us as if she could physically block the answer. Her alpha protective instincts flared visibly. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, her scent sharpened with something that looked a lot like fear. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something there. Guilt, maybe, or calculation. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she had been doing it for a long time. "This is Leo, a friend of the family. He's between apartments and looking for work down here. So I told him he could stay a few days. That's all." Leo. I knew the name. Leo Vargas. Julian's first serious boyfriend. They had dated through most of college and broken up after graduation. According to Julian, it had ended because Leo wanted to move to New York and he didn't. He had described it as one of those relationships that belong to another lifetime. Young love. Pretty but impractical. He had talked about Leo the way people talk about someone they once knew in a different version of themselves, someone who existed before they became who they truly are. I had never been threatened by it. People had pasts. Omegas especially had histories that didn't always fit neatly into the boxes we built for them. At least I had thought they were supposed to stay in the past. I had thought that when Julian chose me, he chose me completely. I had thought that our life together was built on something solid, something that couldn't be undone by a ghost from college. But Leo's alpha scent was unmistakable even through Patricia's defensive posturing. The sandalwood and sea salt had a slight edge now, anxiousness leaking through, and underneath it something else. Something that smelled like Julian. A faint trace of cedar and bergamot and something warm, the way skin smells after hours tangled together, after sleeping in the same bed, after becoming familiar in ways that no one else should be. Leo had been wearing that sweater for hours. He had been sleeping in it. He had been making love in it. He had been living in it. I looked at the sweater again. The cashmere I had bought for Julian. The sweater he had said was like being wrapped in me. The sweater that now belonged to someone else. The sweater that had become a symbol of everything I had given and everything I had lost. He doesn't have clothes of his own? Patricia's expression hardened. He took a shower. It's an old sweater. Don't start making something out of nothing. Where's Julian? I told you. He went out. His shoes are right there. Patricia's eyes dropped to the floor. That was when the bedroom door opened. Julian walked out wearing lounge pants and a gray hoodie. His hair was flattened on one side, the way it got after a nap. He looked rumpled and comfortable in a way he hadn't looked with me in months. He looked relaxed, safe, at home. His beta scent, usually mild and neutral, was slightly more pronounced with the faint tang of recent sleep. He had been sleeping here, sleeping in the bed I had bought, in the house I had paid for, with the man I had never known about. He saw me and froze. His body went rigid. His eyes widened. Then his face tightened, something closing over his features like a door slamming shut. How did you know I was here? It was such a revealing first question that I almost laughed. Not what are you doing here? Not I can explain. Not even this isn't what it looks like. How did you know? As if the real problem was that I had caught him. As if the only issue was my timing. As if everything would have been fine if I had just stayed away a little longer. You said you were in Boston. He rubbed a hand over his face. The conference ended early. I came down to see my parents. Leo happened to be here. That's it. He happened to be here wearing your sweater? It's a sweater, Marcus. And sleeping in the master bedroom? His jaw flexed. The house has 4 bedrooms. Why does it matter which one he uses? Are you staying here too? He exhaled loudly. I've had a brutal month at work. Can you not interrogate me the second you walk in? Patricia jumped in immediately. Exactly. Julian works hard. He doesn't need to come home to more pressure from you. You make everything about money and schedules and plans. You don't understand how exhausting that can be for a man. I looked at her. Her eyes were hard, defensive, her alpha instincts screaming at her to protect her offspring. I understood that. I might have respected it, even if she had been protecting him from anything other than the consequences of his own choices. But she wasn't. She was protecting him from accountability. She was helping him build a life on lies. Then I looked at Leo. Leo hadn't said a word. His eyes were lowered, his fingers pinching the hem of Julian's sweater, twisting the fabric between his fingers in a nervous gesture. He looked young, uncertain, like someone who had stepped into a situation and suddenly realized he didn't know the full story. His alpha instincts were clearly screaming at him to protect what he saw as his, but he was holding himself back, waiting, watching. He had the posture of someone who was trying to figure out which way to jump. Julian glanced at him and softened in a way he hadn't softened toward me in months. His entire posture changed. The tension left his shoulders. His scent mellowed. He stepped slightly closer to Leo, not quite touching him, but positioning himself as a shield between Leo and me. He was protecting him. He was choosing him. Leo, he said, don't worry about this. None of this is your fault. You are not alone. That was the moment the last excuse died. I had spent 3 years believing that Julian's distance was my fault. that I was too needy, that my omega instincts made me too clingy, that I asked for too much attention, too much reassurance, too much affection. I had been told my whole life that omegas were demanding, that we required too much, that we were emotional drains on the people around us. I had tried so hard to be different. I had worked so hard to be low maintenance, independent, strong. I had written books. I had earned money. I had bought houses. I had proven, over and over, that I was not the stereotype. And still it hadn't been enough. Still he had looked at someone else with tenderness, and I realized he had never looked at me that way. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. He had looked at me like I was the person who paid for things. The person who made his life easier. The person who provided the house and the car and the credit card with the 6-figure limit. The person who was useful. Leo was the person he loved. I took out my phone. I photographed the entryway. The wine glasses. Leo's things in the living room. The shoes. Julian's Oxfords. The red-tape charger. The toiletries bag. I took a slow, deliberate video, panning across the room, capturing every detail of the life he had built without me. The evidence of his betrayal was everywhere, and I wanted every piece of it. Patricia stepped toward me. "What are you doing? This is a family home." "No," I said. "It's my house." She stared at me. I looked at Julian. "I want everyone who doesn't live here legally out today." For the first time, he looked genuinely confused. Not angry, not defensive, but confused. Like the thought that I could enforce consequences had never occurred to him. Like the thought that I might actually leave had never crossed his mind. "What?" "I'm selling the house." Patricia's voice shot up. "You can't sell this house. You bought this for us. I bought it for you to retire in. I didn't buy it so your son could use it as a private hotel with his ex-boyfriend." "Don't be disgusting," she snapped. "You're seeing what you want to see. Then this should be easy. Everyone leaves." Patricia planted her hands on her hips. "You married into this family. You don't get to act like everything is yours just because your name is on a piece of paper." I stared at her. "So you do understand whose name is on the piece of paper?" Her mouth closed. The words had landed. She knew. She had always known. The house was mine. The money was mine. Everything Julian had showed Leo, everything Patricia had taken for granted, it all belonged to someone else. Someone who had been generous enough to share it, and foolish enough to believe the sharing was reciprocated. Julian stepped closer. "Enough. Leo can leave if that's what this is about. You don't need to threaten my parents or sell a house, because you're jealous." "I'm not threatening anyone." "Then what do you want?" I looked at him for a long time. I remembered the first time we met. A book signing in Atlanta. He had been in the front row, his eyes bright, his scent warm and inviting. He had asked me a question about character motivation, and I had been so struck by his earnestness that I'd stumbled over my answer. We went for coffee afterward, then dinner, then a walk along the river. 3 years later, I had married him in a small ceremony on the porch of the beach house I would eventually buy for his parents. I had loved him completely, entirely, without reservation, and he had used that love to build a life for himself while giving nothing back. For 3 years, I said, every serious argument between us ended the same way. I would give in first. Not because I thought you were right, but because I believed marriage wasn't supposed to be about winning. If I could absorb one more inconvenience, cover one more bill, smooth over one more conflict, I thought that meant I was protecting our relationship. I thought that was what love looked like. He was watching me now, his expression guarded. Leo had stepped back, his alpha instincts warring with his uncertainty. Patricia was still standing there, her arms crossed, her face a mask of defiance. Eventually, you stopped seeing compromise as something I chose. You started seeing it as something you were owed. I paid for the house. I paid for the card. I paid for your parents' medical bills. I paid for the lifestyle you showed Leo. And every time I paid, you took it as proof that you deserved it. "Marcus, keep him," I said. He blinked. "What? You don't need to send Leo away to prove anything to me. Keep him. I'm selling the house." I turned and walked out. He followed me onto the porch and grabbed my wrist. His fingers were strong, insistent. His beta scent flared with frustration, something acidic and sharp cutting through the calm. His grip was tight, almost painful. "Marcus, if you walk away like this, don't come back crying when you calm down." I looked at his hand. His wedding band was still on his finger. The white gold band I had chosen for him, engraved on the inside with the date we met. He was wearing it. He had been wearing it while he slept with Leo, while he shared a bed with someone else, while he promised forever to someone who had never been me. I wondered if Leo had noticed it. I wondered if Leo had asked about it. I wondered if he had told Leo the same stories he had told me, the same promises, the same lies. "Don't worry," I said. "I won't." I pulled my wrist free and walked to my car. I didn't look back. I got into the driver's seat and sat there for a long moment, my hands on the steering wheel, my heart pounding against my ribs. I was an Omega, and my instincts were screaming at me to go back, to fix it, to make him love me again. The bond that had once resonated with his emotions was still there, a faint hum beneath my skin, a biological imperative that had been drilled into me since birth. Omegas were supposed to be nurturing, forgiving, understanding. We were supposed to smooth things over. We were supposed to keep the peace. I had been doing that my whole life. I forced myself to start the engine. The house sat on the North Carolina coast, a little over 200 miles from our home in Charlotte. I had bought it because Julian had spent years talking about how much his parents wanted to retire near the ocean. Gerald had gone through a difficult cardiac procedure the year before. I had believed I was helping people I considered family. I had believed that investing in their happiness was investing in our future together. I could afford to. I was a commercial novelist with a backlist that generated royalties and licensing income. My books sold steadily. My foreign rights had been snapped up by publishers in a dozen countries. I had made smart investments early in my career, before I met Julian, before I had anyone else to think about. The down payment and closing funds had come from an investment account I opened years before I met Julian, along with proceeds from rights I had owned before the marriage. I had kept the purchase records because writers learn to keep records of everything. Contracts, royalty statements, tax documents, every piece of paper that might matter someday. At the time, none of that had felt defensive. It had felt like paperwork. It had felt like being a responsible adult. I had never imagined I would need to use it as a weapon. The first call I made was to the issuer of the premium credit card account Julian had been using as an authorized user. The card had a limit of $50,000. He had used it for everything: groceries, gas, clothes, restaurants, travel. I had never questioned it. I had never looked at the statements. I trusted him. "I need every authorized user card on my account disabled immediately," I said. The representative verified my identity twice. He asked if I was sure. I said yes. He asked if I wanted to speak to a supervisor. I said no. The whole process took less than 5 minutes. The second call was to Jenna Morales, the realtor who had helped me buy the beach house. "I want the property listed," I said. "Start with an updated valuation and let me know the fastest clean path to market." "Marcus? Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Just get it listed." The third call was to Rachel Kim, a family law attorney my accountant had recommended when Julian and I first started combining finances. I had met her once, months ago, at a casual dinner. She had seemed sharp, pragmatic, unimpressed by sentiment. Exactly what I needed. Rachel listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question. "Are you asking me what your options are, or are you telling me you've decided?" I looked up at the second-floor windows of the beach house. A white curtain moved in the ocean wind. For a second, I saw Leo's silhouette behind it. He was watching me. I wondered what he was thinking. I wondered if he had any idea what he had walked into. I wondered if he knew that the beautiful house, the expensive lifestyle, the effortless money, none of it had ever belonged to Julian. "I've decided." Rachel's voice changed immediately. "Then stop arguing with him. Save everything. Don't delete messages. Keep communication in writing when you can. Send me the purchase records for the beach house, your pre-marriage account statements, and 3 years of major transfers. We'll sort fact from emotion first." Okay. When I ended the call, I realized my hand was shaking so badly I had to set the phone in the cup holder. I sat there for a minute, breathing. The ocean was visible through the trees, a glittering strip of blue. I had loved this view once. I had thought it represented everything Julian and I could build together. Now it looked like a lie. I started the car and drove back to Charlotte. That night, Julian called 17 times. I didn't answer. He left messages. The first one was angry. What the hell is wrong with you? You can't just show up and start throwing accusations around. The second was confused. I don't understand what you think you saw. The third was pleading. Baby, please call me back. We can talk about this. By the fifth, he was back to angry. By the 10th, he was threatening. If you don't talk to me, there will be consequences. I deleted them all without listening to the full versions. I could feel his emotional state through the fading remnants of our bond, and it was turbulent, chaotic, the emotional thrashing of someone who had been caught and didn't know how to escape. I muted the bond as much as I could. I had been doing that a lot lately, without even realizing it. At 9:30, an unfamiliar number appeared. I answered because I knew it was him. He didn't say hello. You shut off my card. I stood by the window of the Charlotte condo I had bought years before our marriage. The same place where I still kept my home office. I could see the city lights spread out below me, a web of gold and silver, and I remembered buying this place too, with my own money, years before I knew Julian existed. Yes. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? Where were you? Julian. I was at a restaurant with my mother. The card declined. In front of everyone. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry that was embarrassing for you. His voice sharpened. Don't patronize me. You gave me that card 3 years ago. You don't get to just turn it off without warning. It's my account, I said. You were an authorized user. I removed you. Turn it back on. No. Marcus. Stop being insane. Leo stayed with my parents for a few days. That's it. You're blowing up our marriage over nothing. You're selling a house. Shutting down cards. Calling lawyers. What do you call that if not crazy? I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window. He still thought this was a tactic. He believed I was trying to scare him into sending Leo away. He believed I would eventually relent, the way I always did, the way I had always done. He believed that I loved him enough to swallow this, too. He believed that my love was infinite, my patience inexhaustible, my resources bottomless. Julian, I said. Keep him. What are you talking about? Keep him. I'm selling the house. I hung up. For the next 2 days, I did what I should have done long before things got this far. I looked at the money. I started with the ordinary charges, because ordinary charges tell you how people actually live. There were Friday grocery deliveries to the beach house, when Patricia had told me she and Gerald were away. There were gas charges along the Charlotte to Wilmington route on weekends. Julian claimed he was golfing with clients. Restaurant bills near the riverfront on nights. He said he was working late. Coffee shop purchases in neighborhoods I didn't recognize. A movie theater in a town I'd never visited. A florist delivery to an address I didn't know. One grocery account had been switched so often to the beach house address that the app had saved it as a favorite location. The first delivery was almost 5 months old. 5 months. The affair had been going on for 5 months. I clicked through the itemized receipts. Steaks. Sparkling water. Expensive coffee. A bottle of gin. Julian liked. Greek yogurt he ate every morning. A brand of oat milk I had never bought because I hated it. Fresh flowers. Premium ice cream. Wine from a vineyard he had mentioned wanting to visit someday. It was such a small thing, that oat milk. But I remembered opening our refrigerator in Charlotte one Saturday and wondering why Julian had barely touched the groceries I had bought. I had asked if he was eating out more, and he had said he was trying intermittent fasting. Apparently, he had just been eating breakfast somewhere else. With someone else. I opened my calendar and matched charges to the explanations I remembered. A Saturday client golf outing lined up with a seafood restaurant in Wilmington. A Thursday late meeting lined up with a hotel in Raleigh. A weekend he said Gerald was sick lined up with dinner and a wine shop near the coast. Each line item was a small betrayal, but together they painted a full picture. The picture did not arrive all at once. It assembled itself transaction by transaction. That was what made it impossible to dismiss. Writers are strange about records. At least I am. For years, every book, every royalty statement, every foreign rights payment, every licensing check, every tax estimate, and every investment transfer had been labeled and archived. It wasn't because I distrusted Julian. It was because publishing income could be irregular and organization kept me sane. That habit became a shield I had never expected to need. I pulled the beach house closing records. Furniture. Insurance. Improvements. Taxes. Then I downloaded 3 years of card statements from the account Julian had used. At first, I was only trying to separate ordinary household spending from purchases that might matter in a divorce. I was thinking about property division, not betrayal. Then I found a charge from 7 months earlier. A jewelry store in Atlanta. $8,200. I remembered that month clearly. It had been our anniversary. Our 3rd anniversary. Julian had brought home supermarket flowers, a bottle of wine, and a box of chocolates. He had apologized for not doing more because, according to him, a commission payment at work had been delayed. I had kissed him and said I didn't care. I really hadn't cared. I could still see that anniversary night clearly. Julian came home almost an hour late carrying a grocery store bouquet wrapped in clear plastic. The roses were already opening too far at the edges, their petals starting to droop, some of them already brown at the tips. He put a bottle of red wine on the counter and kissed my cheek. His eyes were tired. His shoulders were slumped. "I'm sorry this is low-key," he said. "That commission I told you about still hasn't cleared. I didn't want to put anything stupid on a card." I had been finishing edits all afternoon, and I remember feeling guilty that he looked embarrassed. Guilty that he had to apologize. Guilty that I had been so focused on my work that I hadn't noticed how stressed he was. "You don't need to buy me anything," I told him. "Seriously. We can order Thai food and call it a night." He smiled like I had rescued him from something. We ate takeout on the sofa. I gave him a watch strap he had mentioned wanting, a simple leather band, nothing expensive, but he had said he wanted it, and I had remembered. He gave me the supermarket flowers and chocolates. When he apologized again, I actually told him that money was the least interesting thing about our marriage. At the time, I believed that sentence. Now, looking at the statement, I realized the $8,200 jewelry charge had posted at 2:17 that same afternoon, hours before he came home and told me money was tight. He had not been unable to afford a meaningful anniversary gift for his husband. He had been using his husband's credit account to buy a meaningful gift for someone else. That distinction hurt more than the price. The card statement linked to an electronic receipt. I opened it. The purchaser was Julian Covington. The delivery contact was Leo Vargas, with an address in Wilmington. I kept scrolling. Boutique hotel stays. Airfare. Restaurants for 2. Men's perfume. A home goods store near the beach house. Each charge was a small piece of the life he had built with Leo. The life he had built using my credit, my trust, my money. Then I found a hotel confirmation that had been forwarded to the email tied to the card account. 1 room. 2 registered guests. Julian Covington and Leo Vargas. The date was a Thursday night in April. Julian had told me he was entertaining clients in Raleigh. I had spent that evening alone, working on my manuscript, eating leftover pasta, wondering why he hadn't called. I saved the receipt as a PDF and forwarded it to Rachel. There was no longer anything to argue about. Whatever label Julian wanted to use, this had not been a misunderstanding at the beach house. The dates went back months. The patterns were clear. This was not a single mistake. This was a life. A parallel life, built on my foundation, using my resources, with my permission carefully manufactured and never actually given. I exported everything and sent the files to Rachel. She called 30 minutes later. "Preserve the original statements," she said. "And think carefully. Has Julian ever asked you to sign anything related to refinancing, adding an owner, securing a line of credit against the beach property? Anything like that?" I sat very still. For months earlier, Julian had brought home a folder from a bank. He said it was information about setting up a family line of credit so his parents would have emergency access to funds if something happened and I was traveling. I had been 40 pages into a deadline and barely looked at it. I'll read it after I turn this book in, I had told him. He had smiled, said whenever you have a minute, and never mentioned it again. I went to the filing cabinet in my studio and found the folder at the bottom. It was not a simple emergency credit proposal. Near the back was a consultation summary about changing title and adding a spouse as a co-owner as part of a future refinance. One printed note read, "Consider adding spouse to deed before restructuring." My hands went cold. And then I remembered a dinner at Patricia's house 2 months before that folder appeared. We had been eating roast chicken when she said almost casually, "Marcus, since we're all treating the beach place as the family home now, wouldn't it be easier if Julian were on the deed too? God forbid something happened to you while you were traveling." I had laughed because the question seemed so oddly timed. "My estate plan already covers emergencies," I said. And the attorney who handled the purchase told me not to change title casually. Patricia smiled immediately. "Oh, honey, I didn't mean anything by it. I just worry. That's what mothers do." The subject disappeared at the table. That night, though, Julian brought it up again while we were getting ready for bed. "You made Mom feel stupid," he said, pulling off his watch and setting it on the nightstand. I answered her question. "You turned a simple family conversation into a legal lecture. Because she asked me to change ownership of a house." He shook his head. "This is what I mean, Marcus. Everything with you becomes a transaction. A deed. A contract. A spreadsheet. Sometimes family is just family." I remember standing there with a hairbrush in my hand, wondering if he was right. I had always been careful about money. I had always kept records. I had always made sure everything was documented. It wasn't about trust. It was about my upbringing. My parents had lost everything in a bad business deal when I was young, and I had learned early that paper mattered, that signed agreements mattered, that ownership mattered. But Julian had made me feel like I was being petty, obsessive, controlling. He had made me feel like my caution was a flaw, a failure of love. The next morning, I had texted Patricia an apology for sounding defensive. Now the memory changed shape completely. She had not asked a harmless question that I had overanalyzed. She and Julian had already been discussing the title behind my back. And when I did not cooperate, they had made me feel guilty for noticing what they were doing. That night, I searched old messages. Months earlier, Julian had once sent me screenshots from a family group chat because he was annoyed that Patricia kept asking him about paperwork while he was at work. At the time, I had only read the last message. Now I zoomed in. A few lines above it, Patricia had written, "It still isn't right that the beach place is only in Marcus's name. You're married. Eventually your name needs to be on it too." Julian had replied, "Relax. He doesn't think like that. He trusts me, Mom." "Patricia, then don't make it a big issue. Let him get used to calling it the family house. Later you can say it's for refinancing or estate planning." I read the exchange 3 times. That was the moment the betrayal stopped being about Leo. Leo wasn't even the part that made me feel sick anymore. The deeper truth was that Julian and his mother had already decided that anything I earned would eventually become ours. And anything that became ours would eventually become theirs. My work, my savings, my property, my willingness to help. They had treated all of it like a resource that would keep renewing forever. Like I was a well that would never run dry. I sent the screenshots to Rachel. Her reply came quickly, not dispositive by itself, but relevant to intent. Save originals and metadata. Do not confront him about this yet. The first real pushback arrived the following morning. Rachel forwarded me a letter from Julian's attorney. It was calm, professional, and far more unsettling than any of Patricia's voice messages. Julian was asserting an equitable interest in the beach house. The letter pointed out that the property had been acquired during the marriage and claimed marital money had contributed to insurance, taxes, furnishings, maintenance, and improvements. It also warned that he would object to any sale that ignored his claimed rights. For the first time since I left Wilmington, I felt something close to fear. I called Rachel immediately. I thought we traced the purchase money. We did. Then why can he claim this? Because good facts are not magic words, she said. The source of the purchase funds matters. So do any marital contributions after purchase. Title matters. Timing matters. The exact character of every contribution matters. We do not win by pretending he does not exist. We win by documenting what is actually his and what is actually yours. Could he get half? Nothing I've seen supports that conclusion. But I am not going to tell you there is zero risk just to make you feel better. Strong is not the same as automatic. I hated that sentence. I also trusted her more for saying it. For the next 3 nights, my dining table disappeared under statements and closing files. Rachel's paralegal sent me a spreadsheet with categories: acquisition funds, taxes, insurance, repairs, improvements, furnishings, utilities, transfers from joint accounts, transfers from separate accounts. I traced every line I could. The original purchase funds came cleanly from the premarital investment account, and Wright's income Rachel had already identified. Most property expenses had been paid from an account funded by those same sources. A few carrying costs had come from a joint checking account. One deck repair had been paid from marital income. There were legitimate contributions to account for. A week earlier, the uncertainty would have terrified me. Now I only wanted the numbers to be accurate. If there were legitimate marital contributions, we would account for them. What I would not do was turn those contributions into an imaginary half of a house, just because Julian had spent 3 years treating my success as something he would eventually inherit. 5 days after I listed the beach house, Julian, Leo, Patricia, and Gerald finally vacated it. Not because they suddenly respected my decision. Rachel's formal letters made it clear that turning the property into a family battleground would only make everything uglier and more expensive. Patricia and Gerald went to a short-term rental while they figured out what to do next. Julian did not tell me where he went, and I did not ask. Patricia left me 26 voice messages the day they packed. I listened to less than a minute total. In the first message, she said I had destroyed the family. In the second, she said Omegas who cared too much about independence always ended up alone. In the third, she said I would regret this when I was old and no one loved me. In the fourth, she cried. In the fifth, she was angry again. In the sixth, she threatened to tell everyone in my publishing circles what kind of person I really was. I deleted all of them. When Jenna went in to prepare the property for photographs, she texted me pictures. 2 coffee mugs on the nightstand. A few shirts still hanging in the main bedroom closet. A toiletry bag in the bathroom. A half-empty bottle of cologne on the counter. A book on the nightstand, spine cracked, pages dog-eared. A silk scarf draped over a chair. A framed photograph of Julian and Leo, laughing together on the beach. Leo's pale hair was windswept, his eyes bright with joy. Julian was looking at him like he was the most wonderful person in the world. He had never looked at me like that. Not once. Do you want any of this boxed? Jenna asked. No. Throw everything away. I want the house empty. The property received an offer faster than I expected. I didn't slash the price to punish anyone. I accepted a clean, reasonable offer from buyers who wanted a quick closing. They were a young couple, an alpha and an omega, with a baby on the way. They had saved for years. They wanted to raise their child by the ocean. I approved the offer without negotiation. Then the title attorney slowed everything down. Rachel called me after speaking with the closing office. Your tracing case is strong, she said. But Julian is asserting a property claim, and the closing attorney wants a clean conveyance. We're not turning the closing table into a family law trial. So what happens? We give him a choice. He can sign the documents needed to let the sale close without giving up whatever equitable distribution argument his lawyer thinks he has. The net proceeds stay in my trust account until we allocate them by written agreement or court order. Or he can try to block a good sale and explain to a judge why preserving his leverage matters more than preserving the asset. Julian chose the first option after his own attorney explained that refusing to sign would not magically make half the house his. At closing, he signed the necessary papers in a different conference room. I never saw him. When Jenna and I stepped outside afterward, she looked back toward the water. You sure? This place is going to be worth more in a few years. There are other good houses. That's true. I don't want this one. The sale was done. The money was not mine to spend yet. It sat in Rachel's trust account while the lawyers sorted out the classification. That was fine with me. I wanted a clean ending more than a dramatic one. The next afternoon, Leo came to see me. He was waiting outside the building where I rented office space for my writing business. He wore a simple white shirt and almost no cologne. His pale blonde hair was neatly combed, tucked behind his ears. His alpha scent was subdued, almost non-existent. He looked less like the man I had found in my husband's sweater and more like someone who wanted to be taken seriously. Marcus, can I have 10 minutes? I almost kept walking. Then he said, I'm not staying at the beach house anymore. I stopped. We went to the coffee shop downstairs. Leo wrapped both hands around his cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. Up close, he looked more tired than I expected. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, and he kept checking his phone without unlocking it, just touching the screen to make sure it was still on. Before you say anything, he added, I know what this looks like. Do you? He flinched. The day the card stopped working, I asked Julian why he couldn't just use another one. He told me you handled the big accounts because you were better with money. I thought that meant the two of you had agreed on it. I waited. Then I asked him about the beach house. He said it was complicated. Complicated how? First he said you bought it together. Then he said technically it was in your name. Then he said that wouldn't matter in a divorce because you'd been married long enough. 3 years. Apparently that was now a financial theory. Leo looked down at his coffee. I started asking questions. He didn't like that. I don't care about you enough to hate you. His face tightened. For a moment, I wondered if I had been unnecessarily cruel. He looked fragile, like someone who had built their life on a lie and was only now realizing the foundation was sand. His alpha confidence, which had seemed so effortless in the beach house, was gone now. He looked like a person who had just found out she was on the wrong side of history. Then he started talking. Julian told me your marriage had been over for a long time. He said you were basically business partners, that you cared about work more than anything else. He said the beach house was something you bought together, but it was in your name because your income was higher and it made financing easier. I said nothing. He said when you divorced, he'd get his share. There it was. He spoke more quickly after that, as if once one lie had been admitted, the rest were easier to release. Julian had told him I had emotionally checked out of the marriage years earlier. According to him, I cared more about deadlines than people. I slept in my office half the time. I had no interest in building a family. I controlled the money because control was the only thing I enjoyed. He said we had basically agreed to separate after my next book came out. He said the only reason it wasn't public was because of contracts and taxes. I almost laughed. The night before I found them at the beach house, Julian had texted me from his supposed Boston hotel asking if I wanted him to pick up coffee beans on the drive home. Apparently, that was how separated we were. Apparently, that was how little he thought of my intelligence, that I would believe he was in Boston while his phone pinged from a coastal town 200 miles away. Did he tell you I knew about you? I asked. Leo looked embarrassed. He said you knew there was someone else, but you didn't care as long as it stayed private. For 1 second, anger rose hot and immediate. Not because she believed him, because I finally understood how convenient Julian's story had been. To me, Leo was an old boyfriend who happened to be near his parents. To Leo, I was a cold husband who had privately released him. To his mother, I was the provider who could be managed until the assets were secure. Julian had not been maintaining one lie. He had built separate versions of reality for everyone around him. He had created a world where he was the victim of my coldness, the hero of his own romance, the rightful heir to everything I had built. And he had believed it so completely that he thought I would never catch up. Leo continued carefully. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I just think this has gotten really hostile. You sold the house. You removed him from the will. Lawyers are involved. Maybe you don't have to leave him with nothing. What would count as not leaving him with nothing? I don't know. Something fair. He hesitated. Then he asked, "The beach house was partly his, right?" I finally understood why he had come. He wasn't here to apologize. He wasn't here to make amends or offer comfort. He was conducting due diligence. He wanted to know what Julian would still be worth after the divorce. He wanted to know if the man he loved would still be able to provide the lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. "No," I said. "The beach house wasn't partly his." His expression changed. The confidence drained out of his face, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "What about the condo in Charlotte?" "I bought it before I met him." "The one you both lived in?" "We didn't both own it." She stared into his coffee. "The car. It's titled to him. I'm not fighting over it. He can keep it. He can also pay the insurance, registration, maintenance, parking, and everything else that comes with it." Leo frowned. He said the car was paid for. I smiled slightly. "It is." "That's not what I said." He looked away. "And the money from the beach house sale?" "It's being held until the property issues are resolved." He looked up quickly. That answer mattered to him. "And the black card?" Now it was my turn to study him. "So he told you about that too?" His cheeks colored. A faint flush spread across his cheekbones. "It was never his card," I said. "He was an authorized user on my account." His fingers went still around the cup. I watched his expression shift as he calculated. The black card had been part of Julian's appeal. The unlimited spending. The effortless lifestyle. The ability to buy whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Leo had thought he was choosing a man who could provide all of that. He was only now realizing that Julian had been providing nothing. I had been providing everything. I picked up my bag. He looked at me sharply. "So what does he actually get?" He asked it too quickly. The performance was over. This was the real question. The one that had been on his mind since I walked in. I stood. "That's a question for his lawyer." Then I paused. "But I can tell you one thing." "What?" "The lifestyle you fell in love with was never his." I left him at the table. Leo had thought she chose a man with a beach house, a luxury car, and effortless money. She had simply never asked who was paying for the illusion. She had never looked at the fine print. She had never wondered why an omega was supporting a beta instead of the other way around. She had made assumptions, and those assumptions had been wrong. Walking back to my office, one sentence stayed with me. "So what does he actually get?" A week later, Julian asked for mediation. We met at Rachel's office. The building was modern, glass and steel, with a quiet lobby and a receptionist who offered us water. Rachel prepared me for it the day before. "Do not go in there expecting an apology," she said. "Mediation is not confession. People come in protecting positions. Sometimes they say ugly things because they think the ugly thing gives them leverage. Your job is not to correct every insult. Your job is to know what result you can live with." What do you think he'll argue? Based on his attorney's last letter? Financial control. He'll say you managed the accounts, removed his access without warning, controlled the housing, and used your higher income to create dependence. I stared at her. He had his own checking account. I know. His own salary. His own retirement. His own cards. I know. He chose to spend most of his paycheck on himself. Rachel gave me a small smile. Good. Save that clarity for the room. When I arrived, Julian was already seated across from his attorney. He looked different. He had always cared about appearances. Even on Saturdays, he cleaned his shoes before leaving the house. His shirts were pressed. His hair was styled. He loved good watches, new sneakers, and the small details that made him feel successful. That day, his shirt was wrinkled. There were dark circles under his eyes. His hair was unwashed, lank against his forehead. The corner of his phone screen was cracked. He looked like someone who had been sleeping poorly, like someone who was starting to realize the ground beneath him was giving way. He watched me sit down. "You lost weight," he said. I opened my folder. "Let's talk about the divorce." His lawyer gave the standard opening about resolving matters respectfully and avoiding unnecessary escalation. Rachel didn't argue. She sat calmly, her hands folded on the table, her beta scent neutral and professional. Julian's attorney went first. He did not accuse me of adultery or cruelty. He did something smarter. He described a marriage with a severe financial imbalance. Marcus earned substantially more. Marcus controlled the primary residence. Marcus controlled the premium credit account. Marcus purchased the beach property in his sole name. Marcus terminated Julian's access to the card without notice and immediately moved to sell property his parents occupied. The words were technically arranged around facts. The story they created was almost unrecognizable. Julian finally spoke. "I never knew what we really had," he said. "Everything was always under Marcus's control. If he was happy, everything was fine. The second he got angry, he could turn off my card and sell the roof over my parents' heads. How is that not financial abuse?" The phrase landed in the room and sat there. For 3 years, I had paid our mortgage, most utilities, vacations, major home expenses, much of his parents' medical support, and nearly every large emergency. I had given him access to an account with a limit higher than his annual salary. I had never questioned a single purchase. I had never demanded an accounting. I had trusted him completely, and he had used that trust to build a secret life. And now the withdrawal of that access was being presented as abuse. My instinct was to defend myself immediately, to explain, to justify, to prove that I wasn't the monster he was making me out to be. Rachel put one finger lightly on the edge of my folder. "Wait," she asked Julian a series of questions. Her voice was calm, unhurried. "Did you have employment throughout the marriage?" "Yes." "Was your paycheck deposited into an account in your name?" "Yes." "Did Marcus have the ability to remove money from that account without your permission?" "No." "Did you maintain personal credit cards?" "Yes." "A retirement account through your employer?" "Yes." "Were you ever prevented from buying food, obtaining medical care, or accessing your own wages?" Julian's jaw tightened. "That's not the point." "Then let's identify the point. The account Marcus terminated was his premier card account on which you were an authorized user." "Correct." His attorney answered before he could. "Correct, with the reservation that the spending pattern may still be relevant to the marital standard of living." "Of course," Rachel said. "And the records will show exactly what that standard of living cost, and who paid for it." That was the first moment Julian stopped looking certain. She simply placed the documents on the table one set at a time. The source of funds for the beach house. The deed. The pre-marriage brokerage statements. The card records. The timeline of Julian's spending with Leo. The title change consultation papers. The family messages. Our joint account history. My publishing contracts and records distinguishing older catalog rights from income earned during the marriage. Then came the records that had nothing to do with the technical classification of property and everything to do with credibility. Rachel placed the $8,200 jewelry receipt beside the anniversary date on our calendar. She placed the hotel confirmation beside Julian's text telling me he was in Raleigh with clients. She placed the title change consultation beside Patricia's messages about getting him added to the deed later. Julian's attorney read each page without expression. Julian did not. He kept rubbing his thumb over the edge of his watch band, a nervous gesture I had never seen before. "You told Leo your husband knew about the relationship?" Rachel asked. His attorney leaned forward. "We're not trying an adultery case here." "I agree. I'm evaluating explanations offered for expenditures and the reliability of statements about the marriage." Julian stared at the table. "I told Leo what I thought was true. I finally spoke." "You thought I knew about him?" He looked at me. "You were never around." For a second, I could not tell whether I had heard him correctly. "I worked from home. You were always working, always writing, always in your office. I came home to empty rooms. And you were spending my money while telling another man I had agreed to it." His attorney started to say my name, but I held up a hand. "No, I'm done." I looked at Julian. "You can call me cold. You can call me ambitious. You can say I worked too much. You can say I was never there. None of those things gave you permission to invent my consent. None of those things made it okay to pretend I had released you. You didn't ask. You didn't tell me the truth. You just took my money and my trust and built a life around hiding from me." He looked away first. Rachel closed the stack. "We're not here to rewrite the marriage. We're here to identify assets, debts, and a workable separation agreement. After that, Julian became quieter. The beach house had been sold, but the net proceeds were still in Rachel's trust account. My records traced the purchase funds back to assets I had owned before the marriage. Julian's attorney argued that some marital funds had gone toward carrying costs and improvements. Rachel did not pretend the answer was automatic. We have a strong tracing case, she had told me before the meeting. Strong isn't the same as automatic. We document every marital contribution, credit it where the law requires, and we don't overclaim. The Charlotte condo itself was documented as premarital property, with any provable marital contribution accounted for separately. Rights to work created before the marriage remained mine. Marital income, retirement contributions earned during the marriage, joint savings, and any provable marital investment in separate assets would be calculated from the records. I didn't ask for revenge numbers. I didn't demand he leave with the clothes on his back. I didn't try to seize every dollar he had ever touched. I wanted one thing, a clear line between his life and mine. The irony was that this frightened him more than any threat could have. For the first time, every part of our lifestyle was being assigned to the person who actually owned it, earned it, or was legally responsible for it. When everything was mixed together under the word marriage, Julian had felt wealthy. When everything was separated, he finally saw his own balance sheet. And it wasn't nearly as impressive as he had imagined. The mediator took us into separate rooms for the next round. That was where the negotiations stopped feeling like a marriage and started feeling like accounting. Rachel and I went through numbers while coffee cooled untouched beside me. We allowed credit for documented marital contributions to the beach property. We calculated joint savings. We separated retirement contributions by date. We identified the few furnishings that were actually worth arguing over and then decided they were not worth the legal fees. Every time the mediator returned with a new demand from Julian's side, the demand was smaller. First, he wanted half the beach house proceeds, then a substantial percentage, then reimbursement for marital contributions, plus a larger share of joint savings. At one point, he wanted me to continue paying part of his parents' housing costs for 6 months because, according to him, they had relocated in reliance on my promise that the beach house was for their retirement. I almost agreed out of habit. The words were already forming in my mouth. Fine. I can do that. Rachel saw it on my face. Is that something you want to do? She asked quietly. Or something you feel guilty refusing? The question embarrassed me because I knew the answer immediately. Guilty refusing. Then don't negotiate against yourself. That sentence was worth every dollar I paid her. About 90 minutes into the meeting, Julian interrupted his attorney. Wait. Everyone looked at him. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. So how much do I actually get? The room went quiet. And suddenly I was back in the coffee shop, hearing Leo's voice. So what does he actually get? They had looked at the same marriage from opposite sides and asked the same question. Leo wanted to know what Julian would still be worth. Julian wanted to know what he could salvage from the wreckage. Neither of them had asked what I had lost. Neither of them had asked what it had cost me to build everything they had taken for granted. I had imagined this moment in 100 different ways. Sometimes in my head he cried. Sometimes he apologized. Sometimes he finally understood that he had lost someone who had loved him completely, unreservedly, with a willingness to sacrifice anything for his happiness. Instead, he wanted a number. Rachel gave him a preliminary range based on the records and explained that the final amount would depend on verified balances and the settlement terms. Julian stared at her. That's it. I spoke for the first time in several minutes. How much did you think there would be? We were married for 3 years. Yes. He looked at me as if I were missing something obvious. As if 3 years of marriage should have entitled him to half of everything I had built, regardless of when I built it or how. Julian, I said, you are not leaving with nothing. You have a salary. You have a car. You have retirement contributions from your job. You'll receive whatever portion of the actual marital assets you're legally entitled to. He laughed without humor. So this whole thing is just you proving I'd be nothing without you. No. I shook my head. I never needed to prove that. Then what is this? I'm just not financing the version of you everyone else believes in anymore. His face went still. We didn't sign the final agreement that day, but the framework was settled. When I stepped into the hallway, Julian came after me. Marcus! I stopped. For the first time since the beach house, he didn't sound angry. There was something else in his voice. Something that might have been regret, or might have been fear. What if I end it with Leo completely? I looked at him. Why would that matter to me? You're really not giving me any chance. You still don't understand. Then explain it. I thought about that. About all the words I had swallowed over the years. About all the times I had let myself be smaller so he could feel bigger. About all the money I had earned and spent and given away, believing it was love. About all the parts of myself I had sacrificed to make him happy, thinking that was what Omegas were supposed to do. This stopped being about Leo, I said, when I realized this is who you are when you think there won't be consequences. You didn't cheat because you were unhappy. You cheated because you thought you could get away with it. You thought I would forgive you. You thought I would keep paying for everything. You thought I would never leave. He swallowed. People make mistakes. Yes. So that's it. It's not that she stays or goes. It's that I saw you clearly. And I don't want this anymore. The elevator arrived. The door slid open. He didn't follow me inside. For the first time, I felt the marriage ending not with an explosion, but with a door closing quietly. The month after mediation was almost disappointingly ordinary. There was no cinematic collapse. No dramatic scene where he begged and I relented. Life simply stopped cushioning Julian. He did not go bankrupt. But he had to pay for his own rent, insurance, parking, groceries, phone, and the family emergencies that used to land on my desk. He still earned a decent salary, but for years most of it had functioned like spending money because I covered the expensive parts of our life. Without that cushion, his budget finally had to match his income. He started driving a less expensive car. He stopped buying new clothes. He complained about his utility bills. He wanted sympathy. I didn't give him any. A few weeks later, our mutual friend Mark called and told me Julian had been fired. I asked one question. Did I have anything to do with it? No. He'd already been on a performance plan. He kept missing client calls, leaving work to argue about the house, and finally blew up at his supervisor. Threw a coffee cup against the wall. Called his boss something he shouldn't have. Mark had worked in the same sales division before moving to another company. It wasn't one bad day, he said. People had been covering missed follow-ups for months. Lately, he started disappearing for hours to deal with lawyers or call Leo. Okay, I said. That was all I needed to know. I had not called his employer, threatened his job, or engineered his fall. He had finally reached consequences I was not there to absorb. 2 days later, I received a text from Leo. You were right about one thing. None of it was his. I did not reply. A second message arrived a minute later. I should have asked more questions before believing him. Then a third. For what it's worth, he lied to me too. I read them once and locked my phone. I did not need an apology from Leo, and I had no interest in building a friendship out of being deceived by the same man. But I understood what he was finally seeing. Julian had sold her a life he did not own. He had spoken about the beach house, the Charlotte condo, and my credit account as if access meant ownership. The illusion held only as long as no one asked for documents. Once the paperwork came out, the romance apparently became less convincing. Later, I heard Leo ended things after Julian finally admitted the beach house, the Charlotte condo, and the credit account had never belonged to him. Leo had stayed for a few more weeks, trying to make it work, but the magic was gone. It's hard to love a man when you realize he was only ever borrowing the things that made him attractive. I did not need to witness the breakup. The separation and property settlement agreement was signed about 2 months after mediation. The legal divorce itself would take longer under North Carolina's separation requirement, but financially the marriage was over. The beach house proceeds were released according to the agreement after the lawyers accounted for the traced separate funds and the limited marital contributions. Julian kept his car and his own accounts. We divided the actual marital assets. I kept what the records showed was mine. Before he signed, Julian looked at me. Do you think you'll ever regret this? No. You're that sure? I'm not doing this because I'm angry anymore. He stared at the agreement for a moment, then signed. His hand trembled slightly. He looked older than I remembered. Sadder. Smaller. I left the office and went back to work. 6 months later, my new novel came out. It was not a copy of my marriage. It was about a man who spent years making another person's life easier without noticing how much of himself he had given away. It was about the quiet, unspectacular work of building something for someone else, and the silence that follows when you finally stop. I didn't need to write the whole truth. I just needed to write what I had learned. Readers kept quoting one line from the ending. It was simple, direct, the kind of sentence that lands like a door closing. I didn't ruin your life. I just stopped paying for it. Months after publication, a text arrived from a number I did not recognize. Can we talk? Then another. I know what I lost now. I deleted both messages. I turned my phone face down, and I went back to work. For the first time in years, my life belonged entirely to me. I was 34 years old. I had a career I loved, a home I had built with my own hands, and a future that was mine to shape. I had been through fire and come out the other side not with scars, but with clarity. I knew now what I would never accept again. I knew now what I was worth. The beach house was sold. The condo was mine. The money was accounted for. The marriage was over. And I was free.